What if I told you learning Mandarin Chinese is just like building a rocket? You know, it might sound completely impossible now, but by the end of this video, I'm going to walk you through 5 stages which I use to go from 0 to fluency fast, without grammar, without boring memorization, and without textbooks. Let's get started. Before we get into the method itself, I should briefly introduce myself. I'm Will, I'm a medical student currently doing my PhD, but at the age of 18 I could not speak a single word of Mandarin Chinese. But fast forward 1.5 years later, and I was accepting interviews on some of the biggest Mandarin learning channels on YouTube, completely in Mandarin. And then if you fast forward another half a year later, I went on to win the UK Chinese Bridge competition, a speaking competition for Mandarin, and went to go and participate in the world final live on Chinese TV. Now, why am I telling you any of this? Because if I can do it, you can do it too. I don't really have that much talent when it comes to language learning. I nearly failed Spanish in secondary school, but this method completely changed the game for me. So let's get into it. So this method is based around the idea that learning Mandarin is like building a rocket, and we'll get into that metaphor a bit later. First of all, I want to say this method consists of 5 steps. Steps 1 and 2 are more for beginners, so if you're not a beginner you can skip straight over to step 3. I've already put the timestamps there so that you can easily find step 3. I recommend that you watch this video right through to the end so that you completely understand the method and how to use it properly. Let's get started. So step 1 is to build the Launchpad. You know, your rocket is not going anywhere. It's not even going to be able to stand up properly without a good Launchpad. And for Mandarin, that is to learn pinyin and pronunciation well. A lot of people neglect this step and they really regret it later on when they reach high levels of fluency in the language, yet they're not really very well understood. There's a lot of misunderstandings because of their lack of emphasis on pronunciation early on, so you build up bad habits as you go along if you don't spend the time at the beginning. Now, this isn't particularly glamorous, just like a Launchpad isn't, and no one really pays attention to it, but it's really important to spend the time. Now, how should you actually go about doing this? Well, I've put in the comments a list of some really good YouTube videos and playlists that I actually used when I was first starting learning Mandarin to really dive into pronunciation. I recommend that you learn initials and finals and how to pronounce them using the various aspects of that, and where you should place your tongue, how you should position your mouth, etc. All of these details at the beginning are really important, but once you've practiced it enough, it will become muscle memory. Now, step 2 is to assemble the rocket frame. This is the structure that's going to get you starting to build your rocket so that it's all ready to go. And for this in Mandarin, it's really important that you spend some time just to learn a few hundred words, just to get yourself started so that you've got a basic vocabulary. Now, there's a few ways of doing this. The way I recommend is you use a frequency list or just HSK, 1, 2 to 3, kind of in that area. Learn a few hundred words just so you've got something to start with. And the most efficient way that I found to do that is to actually use a free app that you can download onto your computer or onto your phone, and that is Anki. And every day add 5 to 10 new words on Anki. So at the beginning, this can be really basic. This can just be a basic flashcard where it's English to Chinese, Chinese to English. And just learn a few words a day. It'll probably take you a month or two. And once you've done that, at the same time, focus on your pronunciation for this part, so that you're applying what you learned in the previous step, and just build that basic vocabulary. So step 3 is to fuel the rocket. And for this, we're going to be using massive amounts of input in Chinese. Now, what's input? Well, put simply, it's listening and reading. But specifically, you want to know what you should actually be doing. Well, you should be finding content that you're interested in and that you can understand the majority of. So if you're coming from step 2, for you, that's going to, at the beginning, going to be quite some basic content. Maybe graded readers are a really good choice at this stage. Some basic Chinese podcasts and basic Chinese videos on YouTube. If you're more advanced, or maybe an intermediate or advanced learner, it might be Chinese TV shows or even novels in the language. Anyway, you're going to choose your inputs every day. You're going to try and get as much of Chinese in your brain as possible by just immersing yourself as much as possible in the language, in things you're interested in and that you can understand the majority of. Now, here I want you to do something that not many people talk about on YouTube, and that is when you're listening and reading, you don't have to pay much attention to this, but every now and then you might find that you encounter a word or a phrase and you're like, that would be really useful for me to know in Chinese. That would be really useful when I next have a conversation in the language. And at this point, all you're going to do is you're just going to make a note of it. So I like to make a note of it on my phone or in a Google Doc, and then I'll come back to it later. So just make a note of all these new words that you're coming across that you think are really useful and interesting to you when you're going about input. At this point, we've already started fueling the engine. So step 4 is actually to fine tune your engine of your rocket. This is where you really optimize your rocket's engine and really make use of efficient learning methods to just accelerate your rate of progress. So input's great, but if you just rely on input, you're going to be learning a lot more slowly than if you start adding in flashcards. So at this point, you're going to be optimizing your retention of what you're learning. Now, do you remember what I said about making notes of useful words and phrases in the previous step? Well, this is where they're going to come in handy. Now what I want you to do is to put them into Anki, as I said, 5 to 10 new flashcards every day, and go about learning them in this way. Now here I often get asked a lot, what kind of flashcard should you use? Well, I tend to use closed deletion flashcards. So what that means is I'll take a sentence from the input that I'm kind of absorbing in, that I'm immersing in, and then I'll put it into Anki as a closed deletion with a small prompt to kind of guide me as to what word's missing if it's not clear from the context. I also review it in a specific way. Most people, when they're reviewing Anki flashcards, they're just trying to get through them as quickly as possible, and that's fine. But what I like to do is spend around 10 to 20 seconds on each flashcard. And when I'm doing that, I'll read out the flashcard, the whole sentence in its entirety in Mandarin, answering the closed deletion. And then I'll try and make a few sentences just based off the initial sentence to try and change it ever so slightly. If you want to know more details about this part of the learning method, what I'd recommend you do is actually go and watch the video. I've put a link to it up here where I talk about this in a bit more detail. Alternatively, you can also use the type of flashcard that we talked about earlier, so using Chinese to English, English to Chinese. But at this stage as well, you want to be focusing on not just words. When you're getting this input, you also want to be focusing on very short phrases. So a combination of these different types of flashcards, 5 to 10 a day, and you'll start to see your progress really skyrocket in terms of how much you can understand and how much you're actually retaining of the language, which is really important. So step 5 is to launch into orbit. At this point, we're ready for takeoff. We're going to go and get some output practice. Now, a lot of people, again, neglect output. They stay stuck at the input phase for so long. You can only keep adding fuel for so long before you need to try and use that fuel up. So what I'd recommend you do is you practice speaking regularly. Now, once you've built a base vocabulary, you've got lots of input, and you're starting to retain what you're learning from the use of flashcards, going and having conversations with natives will cement together everything that you're doing and make everything that you're doing seem so worthwhile and so enjoyable. So if you don't have much money, as I did when I first started learning Mandarin as a poor student, I recommend you go and find language exchange partners. So the way you can do this is there are language exchange groups, throughout the world. No matter where you are, I trust that there's probably some kind of language exchange group that will help you with your Mandarin learning. Alternatively, HelloTalk, Tandem, these kind of language exchange apps are also really good, and that's what I used. So try and find some language exchange partners that you meet with regularly and just practicing talking in the language and having conversations about different topics in the language to really cement together everything that you've been learning. If your finances are a bit better off than the poor student me, then what you can do is make use of private tutoring. So I'm not actually sponsored by italki at all for this video. I just want to make that really clear. But I'd recommend using something like italki or any other of these kind of apps that allow you to find a tutor and try out lots of different tutors until you find one that's good for you. And then you can practice having conversations regularly. Now, the advantage of this is although it costs something, you get 1 full hour of just Mandarin, as opposed to with language exchange where you'll probably get half an hour of Mandarin, half an hour of your mother tongue. For example, if you're teaching, I don't know, for example, I used to teach English to the Chinese people that I'd speak to on language exchanges. So that's also a really good option. Now, when you're doing all of this, you also want your language exchange partner or your tutor to try and teach you new ways of saying things. If you're missing vocabulary, you need to ask them for it so that you can actually, and then make a note of it and put it into Anki. As well as this, get some corrections. When you say something slightly wrong, slightly off, then get them to correct you on it so that you can also learn from your mistakes. Now, there's a fine balance with doing this, because on the one hand, you don't want so many corrections that you feel terrible about your Mandarin. On the other hand, you don't want to be mistakenly thinking that your Mandarin's perfect when in reality you're making loads and loads of mistakes. You want to know some of these mistakes so you can actually go away and sort them out. So it's about finding a balance. Maybe, for example, for me, when I would do my language exchanges, that would be quite heavy on corrections. But when I was just hanging out with friends in the language, there'd obviously be no corrections at all, because it's very relaxed. It's a social environment. So having a balance between these two so that you have good, positive experiences in the language is really important. So now that we've got to step 5, you may ask, what next? Well, all you have to do now is repeat step 3 through to step 5 again and again and again, all the way until you get to fluency. And trust me, if you do this regularly, you stick to this routine rigidly, and you make good habits based around these 3 things, which are input, output, and focusing on retention using flashcards, you generally will skyrocket your Chinese. I just wanted to say here, guys, if you're interested in going a bit deeper with these learning methods, I mean, we haven't had time to cover it all in as much detail as I'd like, because it would take hours and hours and hours to do that. So I actually made a quite extensive ebook going through my whole learning journey and the whole methods in a lot more detail. So if you're interested, you can go and check it out in the link below as well. Okay guys, so that's the end of this video. Thank you so much. I can't wait to see your rockets go into orbit and prepare for takeoff. Let me know how you get on with this method, and let me know what you think of it in the comments below. I'll see you in the next video.